All right, so this week we'll be picking up where we left off last week. And so after 6 comes chapter 7. And so I don't know about you guys, but I struggled this week trying to fill out prep class material just because, I don't know, it felt like the story was pretty straightforward. So I don't know how useful this may be to you, or more of the discussion will help you more. But why don't we just go ahead and jump in. I'll go ahead and read the first section as we get settled. And so starting in verse 1, but the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. For Achan, the son of Camri, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things. And the anger of the Lord burnt against the people of Israel. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Bethaven, east of Bethel, and said to them, "Go up and spy out the land." And the men went up and spied out Ai, and they returned to Joshua and said to him, "Do not have all the people go up, but let's take about 2,000 or 3,000 men and go up and attack Ai. Do not make the whole people toil up there, for they are few." So about 3,000 men went up from there, from the people. And they fled before the men of Ai, and the men of Ai killed about 36 of their men, and chased them before the gate as far as Sherebaim, and struck them at the descent. And the hearts of the people melted and became as water. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell on the earth on his face before the ark of the Lord until evening. And the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their head. And Joshua said, "Alas, O Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all, to give us into the hands of the Amorites, to destroy us? Would that we had been content to dwell beyond the Jordan. O Lord, what can I say when Israel has turned their backs before their enemies? For the Canaanites and all of the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name?" All right. What stands out to you guys in this section? I know I stumbled over some of those sentences, so if we need to reread it, we can also do that.
Joshua's foolish response to getting beat, destroyed, and falling down and tearing his clothes. Because when we get to the very next verse, you find out you think, oh, that's he's repenting, he's mourning, tearing his clothes. No. They knew what they were supposed to do, and they didn't do it. And he's the leader.
Mm-hmm.
Guilt falls on him just as much as it does everybody else.
Yeah.
We ended our class last week, a very brief statement with temptation and sin are not very far away at any time, because they've just conquered Jericho with very little effort on their part, really. Comes right down to it. But and this is right after they've crossed over the Jordan River.
Sure.
They've consecrated themselves before coming across the Jordan River. They go across and they circumcise themselves. Now they go and they obey God by walking around the city 13 times before the walls come down and they go in and slaughter everyone. But then almost immediately there are some of them that sin. They lose sight of what God's plan is.
Yeah. I struggled also last Sunday trying not to jump into chapter 7, just in the class I was teaching, because I was like, and they do all this, but they won't just follow the rules. They're going to mess up. And so I kind of already started jumping into chapter 7. We didn't actually read it, but it was one of those I didn't want to just end on, and they did everything perfectly, because they didn't. They messed up in chapter 7. So that's a good point, Roger. But what else? What else stood out to you guys?
Previously, God had told him what to do.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to go attack Jericho. He makes up his own mind. We're going to take on Ai. Didn't consult the Lord.
Yeah. That's not necessarily how I took it, but that is an interesting thought.
Well, it is, like you said, it is interesting that we are very specifically told the instructions that God gave them, you know, for going up against Jericho. And then, you know, now it's, let's just go do this. We don't need everybody, you know, and they didn't inquire of the Lord.
Because probably if they had,
They get very specific instructions in 8 about AI.
yeah.
I mean, it said, now go up. There's, you know, you wonder if they'd waited a day, right? You give it 24 hours, give it 72 hours. Does that sin come up and they're able to weed out the sin and you don't lose however many of the 36, right?
You would kind of think that they talked to God. He said, you can't go up because there's a problem. Oh, what's the problem?
Yeah. Obviously, he doesn't know there's a problem. I mean, he gets into the last, why did you bring us up? You know? He doesn't know there's an issue. He's about to, but he doesn't know there's an issue.
Yeah.
Isn't it kind of interesting that his response is very much like the people of Israel murmuring in the desert? I mean, that's what got. Those are the kinds of things that they said, where God said, you know, Moses, I'm done with these people.
Learn firsthand.
I'm gonna do away with them, and I'm gonna start over with you. And here's Joshua, who, in all other respects that we've seen so far, has been strong and courageous, has been listening to what God has to say, and yet one defeat, and he's, for reasons that Mike indicated, right? Because we hear what God says to him next. It's not, thank you for your penitence. It's, get up. Why have you fallen on your face? And so it's also interesting that he still says something very Moses-like to end that statement that he, you know, the little speech he makes there in 7-9. For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear about it and will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name? Which is very much what Moses would say in those other circumstances. When God says, I want to get rid of the rest of them and I'll start over with you. Well, God, but what are they going to say about you, that you couldn't bring these people out? And so we have a mixture of Joshua being like the people and being like Moses in the span of 3 verses.
He was expressing his frustrations. Once he got that out, and then he got to refocus.
And then God
You could see where his heart really was.
gave him the tough love
Yeah.
and redirected.
Yeah, you got work to do.
It's just funny to me how they say, we only need 2,000 or 3,000 men. How many men did it take to do Jericho?
Took everyone.
Everyone walking around,
Or nobody.
Yeah.
Whichever
Basically.
way you look at it.
and yeah, but it's the pride all of a sudden that they get that, oh yeah, we can do this. This is nothing. But yeah, there's no mention of inquiring of God.
Sure.
And that fear that we talked about last week that all the other nations had, apparently didn't reach to the small towns.
No.
Well,
Well,
and what
wasn't a very big crowd coming after him either.
we keep hearing the same phrase, the same terms used over and over, like this melted idea. You know, Rahab mentioned it back in chapter 2. The whole land melts in fear before you. When the spies come back, they talk about how the people are melting with fear. It came up again last week, and here it is again. Except this time, it's the Israelites who are melting with fear.
My mind keeps wanting to go back to the divine commander,
Sure.
Who said, "I'm neither for you nor for your enemies," which is, and I guess this is really jumping ahead to the next section, but when God is telling them that I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. So it's kind of still that same concept of the divine commander, that God's not for you, you're not going to be successful.
We talked about that some in our class last Sunday also, where his answer, no, I'm not on either side. What's the implication of that? You better get on the right side. And it's, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Are you coming along or not?
Yeah.
And I'm not just tagging along with whatever you guys decide to do. So yeah, exactly.
Well, since we've already started jumping there, if I get one of you guys to read the next section, so verses, let's just do verses 10 through 15 right now.
The Lord said to Joshua, "Get up. Why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies because they have become devoted for destruction. I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things from among you. Get up, consecrate the people, and say, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow. For thus says the Lord, God of Israel, there are devoted things in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until you take away the devoted things from among you. In the morning, therefore, you shall be brought near by your tribes, and the tribe that the Lord takes by lot shall come near by clans, and the clans that the Lord takes shall come by near by households, and the households that the Lord takes shall come near man by man, and he who is taken by the devoted things shall be burned with fire, he and all he has, because he has transgressed the covenant of the Lord, and because he has done an outrageous thing in Israel.
All right, thank you. So this is kind of well, as we kind of jumped into it, it's a tough love moment for Joshua. This is not a pity party. You guys clearly messed up. Get yourself back in line moment. But what did anything stand out to you guys in these instructions?
Verse 12, because they didn't destroy the things devoted to destruction, they took their place. You are now devoted to destruction until you take care of what you were supposed to destroy. And that's an interesting concept to realize, that if we're hanging on to sin or something, it becomes us. I mean, we take its place of how disgusting it is to God.
I think that's the conversation. I mean, I had a note written in here, just sin affects everybody, even secret sin, right? It's just the sin that erodes the foundation of everything. Like Achan's sin, despite it being a secret, now has 36 people killed. It's going to ultimately affect his life as well. But the fact is like up to this point, you don't know who it is. The narrative stops here. You don't know who it is, but his sin has caused the death of other people. Like everybody's sin, like sin affects everybody. That goes back to, we've talked about it before, but just our faith is not done in a vacuum. If I sin, it affects everybody. It affects my family first, but there is a broader context that it reflects on Christ. If it reflects on Christ, it reflects on the church at large. And this is no more evident than right here.
Yeah.
And we could very well run into some questions this week about how severe this punishment is. There's there's the whole, I mean, you've even mentioned it in one of the previous lessons. I think it was actually the very first one, the background, looking back into Deuteronomy, and then the whole idea of the conquest and killing all these inhabitants, and we've got this mean, vengeful God of the Old Testament that some people see when they look at this, and we're gonna potentially run into that again in the classroom this week.
Yeah, I kind of ran into that this past week. They made the jump of, well, if they're killing all of them, they're not just killing the adults, they're also killing children, they're killing babies.
They
Like,
flat
how
out
is
says
that?
that in chapter 6.
Yeah. How is that? Like, I probably didn't do the best job, but luckily we have like 3 more weeks of you need to go kill everybody to kind of kick that thought around a little. But it is, yeah, I was struggling with how do I teach about it, let alone I wasn't hearing myself teach it, so I don't even know if people who are hearing me talk about it are really grasping what I was trying to convey. Just because it is one of those sticky situations of, you're right. I hear of this New Testament God who died for my sins, who is going out and seeking the lost, and he's a good shepherd. He's all these gentle figures, and I think sometimes we overdo some of the gentleness, but it's also one of those, this seems completely opposite of even what a more harsh version of a shepherd would look like. This is a vengeful, wrathful God who is slaughtering thousands. And
Yeah, but you can't say innocent thousands, and that's the whole point. God is holy.
Yes.
You can't
This
make
is-
him angry.
Well, and God has no problem with death. Death isn't a problem to him. Obviously, Jesus proved that.
sure,
So when you stop and think about it from that standpoint, and especially when people talk about, well, they killed the children. Well, where did the children end up? With God. That wasn't a problem for him. It's a problem for us, but it wasn't a problem for him.
sure.
They weren't punished. So when you look at it from that standpoint, it's a little easier to say, okay, still, why did God do it? Because he's a holy God, and he said that's what he's going to do. Today it's the same thing, the lesson for this week. He said this is what's going to happen if you disobey. They did it anyway.
And why did Israel stay in Egypt for 400 years? Because the sin of the Canaanites had not yet reached its
He was being patient.
Yeah. They deserved judgment for years. Now it's coming. We're just upset with the way God's doing it. But it's the whole clay and potter thing. It's how can we be upset with God for avenging his holiness?
And I thought about that because they're doing this lottery, so to speak, narrowing down who the one that was wrong. You wonder, why did they go through that? Why did God go that route instead of just saying, go get Achan? Was it maybe he was giving Achan a chance to step up and confess? And as he narrowed down and got closer and closer, Achan never said a word until it fell on him. Means he never really repented of it until he got caught. So it makes me, that's what I got to think about. I thought, why? And I thought, well, maybe that's just God's way of being
God's
patient.
patience.
Showing his patience. I'm going to give him every chance to step up.
Mm.
And he didn't do it. He deserved what he got. Something I thought about when you talk about this immorality in the camp. You go back to 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul is jumping on them because of the immorality in the church there and how singular that is.
Sure.
And what he's saying there, I mean, if you're looking at a way to tie that together, that yes, the camp was penalized for what one man did.
Sure.
Well, you go to 1 Corinthians, you find out where the church can be penalized for what one man does too, if you don't choose to stand up for God and what God says.
I immediately thought of Ananias and Sapphira
It's another good
in
one.
Acts. which, it seemed, they gave. I mean, they kept some, but they gave,
Probably generously.
and boom, you're dead. Yeah, and so it's the same kind of, whoa, you got my attention now.
God's holy.
I think that's what goes back to what Mike was saying about the holiness side of it. It's just, we get nervous when judgment happens because we're not holy and perfect, and we don't stand outside of time. We can't see the big picture. We can't see the sins of the Canaanites over 400 years. We don't see the patience. We wouldn't do that to our own children. We've got a limited, finite ability to see it, and we get nervous with
Tell
righteous
everybody that
judgment.
dies in Russia, and then nobody will care that they all get killed and stuff.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. I'm trying to remember where I heard it. And I can't even start to think of where I was reading it, whether it was at the office, was it at home, whatever, but it was something of, kind of related to this point of, we only kind of see one portion of what's going on, and that's just because what we pretty safe to say is some eyewitness testimony or some inspired retelling of the story is what we get. We don't hear at all about really what the Canaanites are doing except little glimpses of things, and we can find artifacts, but that doesn't truly give us a picture of evil. But God has seen all of it, of all time, and it's just He's waiting for the time for the vengeance to be carried out. And it's hard for us to realize, sure, these are people, but right now they're acting as a tool of God to carry out His vengeance. They're fulfilling a role that God has called them to. Because we could then look to other figures throughout the New Testament of God sometimes uses the enemies of Israel to do the same thing to the Israelites. Of, I'm going to raise up Nebuchadnezzar because you guys have truly messed up. You guys have sinned for 4,000 or 400 years, and you've built idols, and you're just destroying the temple. It's time for you to be brought back in honor. You need to face the punishment that you've been.
You adopted all of the idols of the Canaanites that you were supposed to get rid of.
Exactly. I gave you instructions. You haven't listened again and again and again. I'm going to raise someone else up to come and subjugate you and remind you grass is not greener on the other side. It's greener when you follow my instructions because I am trying to do what is good for you and you are ignoring me. But let's go ahead and if someone would like to read the rest of chapter 7, we'll see what happens to Achan.
Early the next morning, Joshua and Israel come forward by tribes, and Judah was taken. The clans of Judah came forward and took the Zerahites. He had the clan of the Zerahites come forward, and the families of Zimri was taken. Joshua had his family come forward, man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, was taken. Then Joshua said to Achan, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and give him the praise. Tell me, what have you done? Do not hide it from me." Achan replied, "It is true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I have done. When I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. They are hidden in the ground and inside my tent, with the silver underneath." So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and there it was, hidden in his tent, with the silver underneath. They took the things from the tent, brought them to Joshua and all the Israelites, and spread them out before the Lord. Then Joshua, together with all Israel, took Achan, son of Zerah, the silver, the robe, the gold wedge, his sons, his daughters, cattle, donkeys, and sheep, his tent, and all that he had, to the valley of Achor. Joshua said, "Why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord will bring trouble on you today." Then all Israel stoned him, and after they had stoned the rest, they burned them. Over Achan they heaped up a large pile of rocks, which remains to this day. Then the Lord turned from his fierce anger, Therefore, that place has been called the Valley of Achor ever since.
All right, thank you, Mike. I know I didn't put this in the notes, but it is something that comes up, I think, one other time this week. But it didn't stick out to me until we just read it again. They built another monument to remind the people of what happened here. Just similar to what they do when they cross the Jordan and they build a monument at Gilgal. And they're building another monument to remind the people of, don't take the devoted things from, if God has devoted it to destruction, God has devoted it to destruction. And if you take it, you are becoming devoted to destruction. And so I think the next one comes up when they're renewing the covenant, but it's one of those moments of, I missed that on my first run through and putting the prep material together. But what else stood out to you guys? If not,
Achan sinned. He says, I saw.
Mm.
Well, you think of David up on his roof. He looked, he saw. How did he react? You look at Eve. You go all the way back to Eve. She looked, she saw the fruit. It's how we react when we see something, when the temptation's there. He coveted. David coveted. Eve coveted. It all ran to that because they did not avert their gaze from what they were looking at back to what they were supposed to be doing.
Sure.
And had they looked away and back to what they were supposed to do, those sins would have never happened. So it's a lesson for us. Can't help but see things, but what do you do when you see things? What's your reaction? Do you continue to gaze or do you look back to God? So I think there's a good lesson there. Because that's interesting because he said, I saw. Well, they all saw because they had to destroy everything. They had to pick out the metals to take back. So they all saw. That's how they reacted to it.
Sure.
That language is nearly always followed up with took or take.
Mm-hmm.
Saw and they took the fruit and ate it. They, Abraham
Took
or
it,
Sarah,
right.
they took Hagar and he sexually assaulted her. They saw and took, David took Bathsheba, right? I mean, all those, and it's in here. He saw among us well, right?
I coveted and I took.
And he took. Every time we as humans see and take, it generally doesn't, at least in the biblical context, is anytime you see saw and took, it generally doesn't go well.
No. And he thought he had committed a private sin that nobody knew about. Except God did.
It's interesting that they use specifically the word covet. You know, I'm hearing echoes of the Ten Commandments and the specific terminology that's used there. Just a tiny little, I mean, there are many other ways that it could have been said. It could have been saw and took, like we see in many other places,
Yeah.
but in this case, it's specifically, I saw and I coveted and took.
It didn't dawn on me until I was reading, but verse 17, you get down to the family of Zimri. That's only two people. That's Joshua and Achan.
Mm.
So Joshua has his family come forward in verse 18, and Achan has his family. I never really paid attention because I always know it's about Achan, so I just skimmed over. Oh, Joshua's there. No, Joshua's family was also potentially the ones who had sinned. That's got to be a heart-shaking moment.
I mean, they're related somehow if they're in the same family of Zimri. So that's,
Or they've got to be at least cousins.
yeah.
So I'm looking at ESV and it says Zabdi. Does anybody else have that? I know names are uncertain.
Zabdi, that's what
I had Zabdi.
In 17?
Yes.
No, you just mark it out and you put 0.
I have Zabdi.
Well, it said the clan of the Zerahites was taken. They brought the clan of Zerahites man by man, and Zabdi was taken.
Oh, we got Zimri in the more reliable translations.
The inspired version. The inspired version says
We'll
Zabdi.
do the inspired version.
What does the King James say? one other thing that stands out to me, I see words that get repeated all the time.
Sure.
And there's a phrase that has begun to pop up here and there that's going to grow more and more ominous the more times we hear it. And it's the "to this day." Right? It starts off as they create these monuments, and they're there to this day. But now we have a monument that's to signify something that wasn't so great that happened, and it's there to this day. Before long, what we're going to find is they drove out everybody except these people who are there to this day. And so I tend to think that those things are intentional and are there as signposts to help us as we're reading through to pick up on this theme. And maybe we go back to the idea that what happens has consequences. These things hang around to this day, and they continue to affect the way that things are happening.
It's jumping ahead, but when you get to chapter 8, verse 29, there's another monument to this day over the king of Ai.
It just keeps going.
Well, and then you also have Rahab and her family are members of the nation of Israel to this day. Well, she's in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And so even to this day, she is still part of the lineage of the nation of Israel and of the family of God, because she's in the most important branch.
And she lied to get into Hebrews 11.
Yeah.
God love her.
In verse 19, I have a footnote with an alternate translation there where it says, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel," and here's where the footnote is, "and give him the praise." The alternate translation or rendering of that says is, "and confess to him." Does anyone else have that?
I have
Confess to him.
the footnote,
The footnote.
but in the text it's give praise. And
The NIV has the phrase "a solemn charge to tell the truth." And so the idea behind it is when they say give glory to God, it means be honest, tell the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that's what it's connected to, or at least
Yeah,
on
and,
mine.
yeah, that's the first part of the phrase, and then the
But I don't
second half
have
of the sentence is and give him the praise is and confess to him. Okay, just curious.
Yeah, mine says, "My son, give glory to the Lord God of Israel, and give praise to him," and give praise as the footnote, and make confession. It's an alternate.
Oh, I see that. Yeah, I guess ours does. The NIV does too. Confess to him.
It just says, "And tell me now what you have done."
Right. Yeah, that's the next phrase in the ESV also.
Okay,
Like
just
Robert
curious.
said, I mean, this isn't repentance, because now he's to the point where
No, he's
everybody's looking at him.
Yeah.
So now it's just, okay, you're guilty, go ahead and,
Sure. I think part of
ninth
it's
graders that my wife teaches when they're caught. Oh, I'm so sorry. No, you're sorry you're caught.
That's not a ninth grader thing.
I know it's not. She deals with it every day.
If we're doing true confession, I'm going to have to put myself in that book here and there.
Yeah.
I think kind of part of that is also God has singled you out, and so just confess that, yeah, He singled you out because you did wrong. He didn't just single you out because it was, again, a fluke wind or light being through the clouds just happened to land on you. No, it's God, and God singled you out. Tell Him why He singled you out.
Isn't that interesting? I'm sorry I interrupted, but it says back in verse 14, "In the morning, therefore, you shall be brought near by your tribes, and the tribe that the Lord takes by lot shall come near by clan." So, are they casting lots? Is that how they're getting their answer from God? I mean, that's what it seems like.
Yeah,
I
'cause-
mean, I don't get that.
To get the tribe.
I don't get the idea that God is talking in Joshua's ear directly. It says by lot.
And it's not like the cloud or pillar of fire is still around.
Well, because this is also after Leviticus, and so my footnote makes mention of the Urim and the Thummim that the ephod had of the high priest, which was used for casting lots.
Yeah.
So they had that at their disposal.
I mean, that's what it. I wonder. I haven't gone back and looked. I don't know how many times that has happened since that was given in Leviticus.
But we know it did in Acts when they chose Matthias.
Right. But
But
I'm
beyond
meaning in the
that,
history
I
of
don't
Israel
know.
between Leviticus and here, or is this the first time they've rolled out the old Urim and Thummim?
I don't know.
One would think not, but
Take a chance.
Well, they probably weren't using it to decide where they're going to lunch because it was just manna. And so,
anyway. Imagine Achan sitting there watching an arrow further down. I mean, we've already talked about it a little bit, but I'm trying to.
Well, I mean, the consequences of what he did. There's 36 people died, he didn't even know why. And then his entire family died. They knew why. But they had to pay for what he did. And that is quite a warning to us in our private sins, especially as men and family. What we do, what kind of an effect can it have on our family?
sure. I kind of took some of what Joshua reacts as he's taking a lot of the blame, like super personally, as like, I must have messed up, God. Tell me what can I do to make it right? And it's one of those moments of, I'm sure if Josh was feeling that way, I'm sure those families were like, man, what did Timmy do that God decided to kill him and not, like, what happened between Jericho where we have this great victory to now? And we kind of mentioned it, like they got ahead of themselves. They started being a little too prideful. But there's also, we had that little notes in verse 1 of chapter 7 of, well, we as the reader know Achan made a mistake, and that's why God has turned his back on him. The people are just sitting there and thinking, I guess we messed up when it seemed like the bar was too high until this moment, and Achan's discovered, and I'm sure that anger that they're feeling towards themselves or something that they perceived as doing wrong was all poured onto, no, it's this guy, we need to, the anger was bubbling up out of him then, just because my family members died and it's your fault. You specifically messed up.
But God had warned, you go back to before they went into Jericho.
Sure.
And he made it clear that this was something that would affect the entire camp, which means there's an accountability that was put into place.
Sure.
So whenever they went in and took the city, devoted the things to destruction, did accountability carry through, or did they forget that? When they got back to camp, was there any accountability put into place to ask everybody, okay, guys, you know the rules, did anybody mess up? Hey, you bring that to us today, how often are we that accountable with one another? We're not. We don't spend that time. We don't get that personal with each other. I don't like being personal with people.
Sure.
But there's still accountability, especially within the church.
Let's go ahead and move on since we don't have too much longer. I'll go ahead and read the next section. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 8. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all of the fighting men with you and arise and go up to Ai. See that I have given into your hand the king of Ai, and his people, his city, and his land. And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoil and its livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. Lay an ambush against the city behind it. So Joshua and all the fighting men arose to go up against Ai. And Joshua chose 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them out by night. And he commanded them, Behold, you shall lie in ambush against the city behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you remain ready. And I and all the people who are with me will approach the city. And when they come out against us, just as before, we shall flee before them. And they will come out after us until we have drawn them away from the city. For they will say, They are fleeing from us just as before. So we will flee before them. And you shall rise up and ambush and seize the city, for the Lord your God will give it into your hands. And as soon as you have taken the city, you shall set the city on fire. You shall do according to the word of the Lord. See, I have commanded you. So Joshua sent them out. And they went to the place of ambush and lay between Bethel and Ai, to the west of Ai. But Joshua spent the night among the people. Joshua arose early in the morning and mustered the people and went up, he and the elders of Israel before the people, to Ai. And all the fighting men who were with him went up and drew near before the city and encamped on the north side of Ai, with a ravine between them and Ai. And he took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai, to the west of the city. So they stationed the forces, the main encampment that was north of the city, and the rear guard that is west of the city. But Joshua spent that night in the valley. And as soon as the king of Ai saw this, he and all his people, the men of the city, hurried and went out early to the appointed place towards Arabah to meet Israel in battle. But he did not know that there was going to be an ambush against him behind the city. And Joshua said to all of Israel, pretended to be beaten before them, and fled into the direction of the wilderness. So all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them. And they pursued Joshua. They were drawn away from the city. Not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. They left the city open and pursued Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, Stretch out your javelin that is in your hand towards Ai, for I will give it into your hands. And Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand towards the city. And the men in ambush rose quickly from their place, and as soon as he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it. And they hurried to set the city on fire. So when the men of Ai looked back, behold, the smoke of the city went up to heaven, and they had no power to flee this way or that. For the people who had fled into the wilderness turned back against their pursuers. And when Joshua and all of Israel saw that the ambush had captured the city, and that the smoke of the city went up, they turned back and struck down the men of Ai. And the others came out from the city against them. So they were in the midst of Israel, some on the side and some on that side. And Israel struck them down until there was left none that survived or escaped. But the king of Ai they took alive and brought him near to Joshua. When Israel had finished killing all of the inhabitants of Ai in the open wilderness where they had pursued them, and all of them laid them to the very last had fallen by the edge of the sword, all of Israel returned to Ai and struck it down with the edge of the sword. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. But Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had devoted all the inhabitants of Ai to destruction. Only the livestock and the spoil of the city Israel took as their plunder, according to the word of the Lord that had commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins, as it is to this day. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset Joshua commanded and took down his body from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day. All right. I know we still got a portion, but I want us to talk about this before we get to a completely different scenario. What stood out to you guys about this?
God gave a plan, Joshua did it.
Yeah.
It worked. Big shock.
Yeah, his tactics, I mean, he does all kinds of stuff. It's kind of, this is, you know, probably textbook, not a military person, but it's probably textbook, you know, feint one way and come at it from a different way. So he outflanked them.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good maneuver. The Jericho one, not great tactics.
Yeah.
But it's,
There is the contrast where in this case, they actually had to do something.
yeah.
I mean,
Joshua took 36,000 men
Yeah.
to kill 12,000. Ain't falling for that 2,000-3,000 anymore.
They also get to take some of the plunder,
Yeah.
which is different.
Yeah, here they get to keep.
To this day is an interesting, that keeps coming up, kind of repeated phrases. You know, obviously this is written at some point in time in the future, and you're looking back, you know, and so there's this conversation of, you should tell your kids about those piles of stones, and that's why that pile of stone's there, and that's why that pile of stones is there, and if you build that town back, you're gonna lose your firstborn, and, I mean, there's a bit of, there's a reason why he's saying to this day. They're, obviously, when they're writing it, you can go find those marks along the road, and that's, you know, you do that with your kids. Hey, we used to live in that house, and we do that, but for them, it's a little bit more tied to the history.
Well, it's proof as well for future generations. This wasn't a fairy tale.
Yeah.
I love this till this day, and then at the end of Joshua, it's choose this day who you'll serve.
Was Bethel destroyed?
It's a great question.
I'm gonna go with yes.
Yeah.
They came out and joined.
Yeah. We know they fall to Israel at some point. It becomes an Israelite city. You can it's kind of hard to just assume that, well, it seems like it's being described that both Bethel and Ai, all of the people are pursuing Israel in this moment. But does that mean they also did the same destruction to Bethel that they did to Ai? Is Bethel part of that 12,000, or is the 12,000 just the citizens of Ai? It's one of those.
it's a blank.
It's a blank.
Miracles that Luke tells us about that the other gospel writers don't even mention. And
Sure.
you're like, well, that's like a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
But to write everything that happened, and that's just it. We're not getting a complete telling of the story like we would write it. We would tell about every single town. But that's not the intent here. What I see in this is, you know, Deuteronomy 18:18, Moses says God's going to raise up a prophet like me, and you need to listen to him. And we know that's Jesus. But who comes on the heels of Moses? It's Joshua. What's Joshua do?
He does what Moses.
Has Moses ever done that?
Yeah.
Yes, he parted the Red Sea by doing this.
And
Defeated the Amorites by doing this.
yeah.
And do we know anybody who saved people by doing this? Then the other side of this is Ai, is a Hebrew name. That was not the Canaanite name of that city.
No.
Because if it was, they're idiots anyway. Because it means ruin.
Yeah.
But what happens with the king of ruin? Hung on a tree. What does that remind you of anybody else? Oh, amen. Jesus, the king of ruins. I mean, we get to see Jesus in here both through Joshua, but also as the king of ruin, dying, becoming ruin for us, becoming sin for us. And so when the apostles and the New Testament writers are telling the gospel story, Joshua chapter 8, and you can see the good news of Jesus dying on the cross and what that means for us.
Well, speaking of towns not being their Canaanite name, Bethel is not either house of God.
Sure.
So
Well, and next week we'll get to Jerusalem. That's not what it was originally called, but it's the king of Jerusalem goes up to battle against the Israelites. Well, the king of Jerusalem will be eventually David, because that's where he makes his town. And when we get to that point in 2 Samuel, they give the other name, but in Joshua we know it only as Jerusalem, and so it's just one of those interesting little bits. But all right, I know it's the last little bit, but it is also important. Verses 30 through 35, we get, I'll read it. At this time, Joshua built an altar to the Lord of God, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones upon which no man has wielded an iron tool, and offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And there was the presence of the people of Israel. He wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written, and all of Israel. Sojourner was native born, and the elders of the officers and their judges stood opposite sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant to the Lord. Half of them in front of Mount Gerizim, and the other half in the front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses and the servant of the Lord had commanded at the first to bless the people of Israel. And afterward he read the words of the law and of blessing and of the curse, according to what is written in the book of the law. Was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones, and the sojourners who lived among them. So this is a significant place that keeps showing up again and again and again. This is Shechem, which is also happens to be the land which Jacob bought back in Genesis and dug a well, which is also Samaria, where we meet the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. Shechem actually appears twice in Joshua. It's at this point, but there's also at the end, he brings the people back to Shechem and choose to say now who you will serve. And I think a big part of this is kind of this whole idea of choosing who we will serve. You have it, at least visually, you have on one side you have blessings and you have one side that is cursings. Because they're reading, at the very least, Deuteronomy. If not all that was written by Moses, which is the Pentateuch. And so you get to this point where not only do we have these monuments that we are to remind the children, but we have the law, we have the message of Moses is to be constantly reminded. And as you cross through this valley where these two mountains stand, remember there's a path of blessing and there's a path of curses. And God is giving us that choice. And I think even as we look into this week, or kind of the things that happened this week, well, Achan had a choice. He could have been blessed, or he could do what he wants, which led to a curse. Because as Deuteronomy outlines it, it's here are the actions that lead to curses. Here are the actions that lead to blessings. It's not. It's. Oh, that's my train of thought. It's once again reminding the people of what they're doing in this land. They're not here to just have a fun time, to do whatever they want. Which takes us back to our discussion last quarter in Galatians of you've been set free from sin and death, not so you can do whatever you want, because some of the things you want to do lead to curses. It leads back to death and sin. What you've been set free to do is so that you're not forced to go to the path of curses. You're allowed and you're free to seek out the way of blessing, the way of God, the will of God. And so Joshua chapter 8 ends with that same idea of here we are in the middle of the conquest. We've crossed over. We've seen great things. We've also doubted some of these great things. But we always have that choice of, are we following a way of curses or a way of blessing? Are we doing the things God wants us to do? Or are we kind of going our own way and ending up on the side of cursing? That's kind of where I have us ending. Next week we are going to try and do 3 chapters, and so if you want to start jumping into chapter 9 this week, have fun doing that. But if not, we'll talk about it next week.
I have one question.
Sure.
11:35, it says, the women and little ones and the strangers who were among them. Who are the strangers? Is that Rahab and family? Is that it? Or do you think there are?
There were Egyptians who left with them also, so there's probably still some Egyptians with them as well.
Sure.
And there might have been Canaanites who, because of their melting in fear,
And
tried to join over, but don't know if that's true or not, but except for Rahab and her family.
Well, because we also see
But there
next
were
week
Egyptians.
the Gibeonites try and sneak over, or they don't try, they sneak over and they convince Israel, yeah, you should let us live.
Another time when you don't inquire of God.
Exactly.
If you go back to Deuteronomy 27, where Moses gives that command to set up the altars, right after he gives that command in verse 9, it says, Then Moses and the priests, who were Levites, said to all Israel, Be silent, O Israel, and listen. You have now become the people of the Lord your God. Obey the Lord your God and follow his commands and decrees that I give you today. I would imagine that here in Joshua, when they've set those up, they're also being reminded of those statements as well that came immediately after that instruction.
Oh, exactly.
This is a place where you became or were identified as the people of the Lord.
Yeah. All right.
And if you Google Shechem, you can see a little rock thing that they're convinced is Joshua's little monument.
Yeah.
Got graffiti on it, but
Oh, yeah.